So, one of the things that people don't understand, just culturally speaking, is we see like in movies and in video games and stuff where like Germans are the bad guy again, that there's somehow World War III with Nazis and from Germany. And it's not possible, okay? For cultural reasons, it's not possible. First of all, World War I couldn't, like a scenario like that couldn't happen with Germany because Germany, they're not willing to have a knee jerk reaction when there's an international incident. Okay. They're a lot more reserved when it comes to international incidents. So, like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand causing, World War I and all that, couldn't happen again. They're also not really stockpiling weapons they don't need out of a knee-jerk reaction that they must go to war. Okay? Now, a World War II scenario can't happen again because they would never fall for another Hitler. They just wouldn't. All right? They demonize them, they hate them, and, they arguably hate them just as much as we do, right? Okay? Could not happen again. But there's a third reason, and this is the one thing that people just kind of don't understand. Germans, they have their own culture and everything, but their interactions with other cultures have deeply impacted them. And to understand this, I have to use an exaggeration. And the exaggeration I have to use is a lot of these like hardcore, Germans, or even just normal Germans, like the normal German soldiers were incredibly demoralized by the orders they were given by their higher ups, and then even the ones that weren't, the ones that were bad mustache man fanboys, those guys were like frolicking in daisies and pish posh and drinking their tea and fancy formal dress all the time and making sure their uniform is spotless. In the American sense of how we would view that, they were pansies. There's not really a word that I can say that's kinder or nicer. Not that I really want to, because fuck the Gestapo. Okay, fuck them. And, but they were pansies, all right? And a lot of Germans were actually soft and sensitive and sweet, and from a cultural perspective, being sensitive and in touch with your emotions as a man is a part of German culture. Okay, so you take an individual like that, and then you expose them to individual brutality, not the machine efficient brutality of World War I. They weren't ready for that either. They understand how machines work. They understand how to use them. They were really good with them. They just, from a mental perspective, were not ready for how efficient, cold, and calculated that type of machine warfare was. And then World War II, they weren't ready for individual brutality. And there are two countries that are the cause of why they would not be ready to fight a World War III and everything in particular. And the very first one, and honestly the actual most obvious one, all things considered, is, well, it's Canada. In Canada, you look at them and, you heard my description of Germans. Oh, they're pansies and whatnot. They're in touch with their emotions and they're very sensitive. And you kind of think the same thing about Canadians, but the thing about Canadians, when it comes to wars, they like committing war crimes a lot. They commit a metric assload of them. Every conflict they've ever been in, they've committed some form of a war crime, okay? And it's not just committing war crimes to accomplish an objective. Some of those war crimes were like playing with human psychology and toying with people just for shits and giggles. And so there are two incidents that I have in mind. But the first incident exemplifies the shits and giggles part really well. So the Canadians had it happen to surround a trench with World War II, Germans and the Nazis in this trench, and the Germans are looking at them. They're surrounded. Okay, they're gonna die no matter what, right? So they're not even bothering to fight back. They've surrendered. Okay. Canadians throw down bread. Okay, and these Nazis have been starving for months on end. They haven't been able to get food or anything. They've been cut off from supplies. They're running low on ammunition. Now they're surrounded. So, they start cheering. Normal human reaction. These people are giving you food. They start cheering and they ask for more. The Canadians then start throwing hand grenades. More and more. They literally bury these guys in fucking hand grenades. They blow them all up. They don't take any prisoners. They kill them all. Okay. Extremely brutal. Oh yeah, here's some food. Yeah, now here's a fucking hand grenade. Eat shit and die, basically. Okay. And they did it for shits and giggles. Now there was another incident with Canadians. Okay. So the Germans, during World War I and World War II, they've had incidents where they've shouted Merry Christmas, and there's been a temporary truce, an armistice for 1 or 2 days, so that the Germans and whoever they're fighting can celebrate Christmas. British gifted them tea, and I forget what the Germans gifted them back, in World War I and in World War II, it happened with the United States as well. A lot of things like knife, oh yeah, here's my knife, oh yeah, here's my pistol, blah blah blah. Okay, and so actually, if you find a knife, a German knife from World War II, for example, an antique shop, it might have come from Christmas, or it might have came from the fact that the United States at the time was A-okay with troops taking trophies. Troops still do. It's not allowed anymore. But I've talked to some of those guys, and yeah, they still take war trophies. Okay, I'm going to tell you that right now. But, I knew one dude, he was in the Middle East, and he had, a full-on schmear. I think that's how a schmear, a sword, okay, that he looted from his time in the service. Okay, but, anyways, so it was normal for the Germans to be like, oh, Merry Christmas, and then the fighting temporarily stops. Well, the Canadian officers ordered their soldiers to not speak. So the Germans pop up on Christmas night to shout Merry Christmas in Canadian language to hopefully celebrate Christmas. And a Canadian soldier, he took aim and shot both of them, and that was that. Fighting continued. They popped up, oh, Merry Christmas. Dead. Okay. That's the level of individual brutality Canada was bringing. They were continuously not taking prisoners, and they were finding really gruesome ways to execute people who surrendered. If you surrendered in a group, you were going to die horribly. If you surrendered individually, you probably were just going to get shot on the spot, and that was it. The Canadians also, they did not treat any of the wounded. They just, put them out of their misery. That's how the Canadians handled the Nazis. Okay. And, world's smallest violin, I guess. Although one could argue that a lot of those guys were conscripted and blah, blah. You can look at it however you want, but that's what happened. In the case of the Americans, so in German mentality, if, an officer is pristine, they're clean, they exemplify cleanliness, they're probably wealthy individuals, they've brought themselves up in the world, they brought themselves up politically, they have a nice uniform and everything, they take care of themselves. And Americans at the time of World War II, some of those troops couldn't even be bothered to button up their uniform. You know, it's common to just see, their jackets unbuttoned, and it's not even a jacket, it's a shirt that's just unbuttoned, and there's a guy running around shirtless with a flamethrower. Okay, completely normal. The French even remarked, like, because a bunch of American platoons showed up in France after D-Day, and the French looked at this lack of hygiene and cleanliness, and a French commander, a resistance commander, was asked, well, what do you think about these guys that are so shapely dressed? And the response from this commander was, well, they dress like free men. So officers might have been really pristine or clean on the American side, or they might have been running around shirtless and not giving a fuck. A pack of cigarettes, and maybe even wearing somebody's skull as a face mask. That thing in Call of Duty World War II, that helmet thing, that was from an actual thing that a American did way back in the Pacific Theater. So, fighting against Japan. Yeah, he just took somebody's skull and was wearing it to cover up the top of half of his face. He had like a pack of cigarettes and bullets right on his helmet. Completely odds and ends, right? Apples to oranges. Well, Gestapo was present on D-Day, and he had never seen Americans before. Okay, and by that I mean he never fought against Americans before. And he's up in this bunker, and he's got his binoculars. He's not even in the fighting. He's just watching with his binoculars as things go on. His job is, to do whatever a Gestapo does. I don't know, but also to report back to command. And he happens to see an American officer. Now, here's the thing. Here's a historical thing that people don't understand. And I have to give you this context, so bear with me. Most Americans, basic infantry, were not issued a sidearm. So they were given their Thompson, their M1 Garand, whatever their main battle weapon was, and that was it. A lot of pistols were either looted off the Germans or were illegally provided, like family mailing them a revolver. Because in American culture, even to this day, we still have a sidearm is what you use for personal protection. Okay, it was actually kind of a problem because they would just loot, and they would even loot MP40s and other things as a sidearm for personal protection. But the most prized thing was like a P308 from like a German officer or something. A lot of looting of those, okay? And then someone would get like a 1911 mailed from home or something crazy, right? Actually it was not even ridiculous to even have like a FN Browning high power mailed from the United States to a American soldier that was fighting. Like, that kind of stuff did happen, right? So, you can spot whether or not somebody's an officer just by watching them with a pair of binoculars, because if they have a battle rifle and a pistol, they are an officer. So this Gestapo, he's watching binoculars, and he notices a man. He just happened to look over. This man was running. A mortar almost hit him. He lost his Thompson. Okay, the guy pulls out a pistol, his 1911, and his knife, and proceeds to continue fighting with only a knife and a pistol, running up the shores of D-Day, okay? Which is already all hell is breaking loose, right? The Germans actually waited like 3 minutes for us to land, and we thought, oh, there's no resistance, before they started opening firing, okay? You had like the Beast of Ohama, who was shooting, who was leading his targets, and he killed like 3,000 men that day. You know, like they had things nailed down to real incredible brutal efficiency. So all hell is breaking loose. Mortars, machine guns. This guy loses his Thompson, right? Now, a German officer losing their like weapon, they would just surrender at that point. But guy pulls his pistol and knife, starts running. So now the Gestapo's really watching this dude because he knows it's an officer, and this dude's uniform is rough shapen and not in the best of shape. So it's already like very polarizing for this Gestapo, because this is a guy who's supposed to be essentially in the same position as him, just on the opposite side. And from what he can see, Americans are doing things completely fucking differently. But whoever this officer was continues his fighting, continuing to make his way up the shore. And he gets pinned down and everything for a minute. And, he ends up getting in a scuffle with a German soldier and loses his pistol in the process and loses his knife. So this American officer picks up a rock, okay, and continues fighting, and actually kills quite a few people with said rock. Okay, just caveman full on unga bunga, right? Well, the Gestapo then promptly writes a letter of complaint to higher command, asking, why are we even fighting the Americans? I just watched one of them lose both his weapons, an officer, pick up a rock, and continue fighting like it was nothing. Like, these guys are animals. Like, we should not be fighting the Americans. Why are we fighting the Americans? Okay, they weren't ready for that sort of brutality. This Gestapo is probably a rich lad. He probably got into his position of power by being wealthy. Okay, he whilst he had no problem, because Gestapo are all hardcore, they had no problem sending people to their death and doing really fucked up shit. They didn't do it directly themselves. No, they kept themselves nice and clean and pristine. And then here's this American officer who's supposed to be, in their eyes, their counterpart, their equal in this matter, and supposed to serve the same function. Yet here's an officer who's running ragged with clothing that probably hasn't been washed, smoking a cigarette, beating people's head in with a fucking rock. Okay? So, that sort of brutality from Americans and from Canadians of these sort of things really just kind of sit in the back of the mind of German people, and they think of the idea of even going to war with the United States or with Canada or with very similar countries. Now, the same could not be said for the Japanese. The Japanese have lived in peace now and everything, and they have a completely different culture than they did. But during the Pacific Theater, the reason why it was so fucking terrible is because the Japanese had a view that if they should continue fighting no matter what, and they should never surrender. That it's dishonorable to surrender to, it's dishonor on their emperor and their family, and their emperor is a god and all that. Well, they would continue fighting no matter what, no matter even if they were going to die, because dying in battle was an honorable thing to do. And they would even, if nobody would kill them and they tried to be captured, they'd just commit harikiri, or I forget the other one is. But they would take themselves out of the picture. They absolutely refused to be captured. But the other thing is they matched our brutality. And so the Pacific Theater was fucking terrible for us because they could match our brutality. Now, that being said, Germans weren't ready for that sort of thing.